Hello, and welcome to A Dash of Salt. I'm Dr. Shelley Ann, and I'm so glad you're here. Whether you stumbled upon this podcast by accident or you're here because the subject drew you in, welcome. SALT is an acronym for Society and Learning Today. This podcast was created as an outlet for inviting fresh discussions on sociology and learning theories that impact your world. Each episode includes a wide range of themes that focus on society and everyday learning, whether formal or informal. So let's get stuck in, shall we? Welcome to A Dash of Salt. Today I'm joined by Dr. Vivian Rath. Vivian Rath is a teaching fellow in Trinity College Dublin and recently completed his PhD on the social engagement experiences of disabled students in higher education in Ireland. He obtained his master's in management from Smurfit Business School, where he researched the employment of graduates with disabilities. He's also a member of the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission Disability Advisory Committee. This committee has a role in the monitoring of the implementation of the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. He has extensive experience providing supports to people with disabilities accessing education and employment opportunities. As a person with a disability, Vivian has been a disability activist for many years, campaigning for greater participation of people with disabilities in public and political life. He's currently working for AHEAD as a project research officer investigating reasonable accommodations in professional placement, or RAPP. I'm delighted to have you on the podcast to speak with you about some of the findings from your research and about the importance of voice in school and community. Welcome, Vivian.
Thank you very much, Shelley, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here with you to discuss this important topic and, of course, to have my voice heard.
Absolutely. I'd like you to tell us a little bit about yourself and about your program of research.
Okay, well, I mean that I've just completed my PhD research on the social engagement experiences of disabled students in higher education in Ireland. And I'm a lecturer in disability and disability rights in Trinity College Dublin. But my interest in this topic goes back a very long way. And in actual fact, I suppose to give some context and background, that goes back to my time when I was in higher education in Ireland. And that when I went to college to study pharmacology, I didn't know at the time that I was actually among less than 1% of the total student population with a disability. So it can be, I felt a little bit alone. I actually felt disabled. But it can be more challenging, I think, for a person when you are very much in the minority and you don't see anybody similar to you in that environment. But in fact, that all changed for me when I, in second year in college, when I lived on campus with my brother, Paddy, and another disabled person who was visually impaired. And we all lived together in a house on campus. We went on actually then to establish a student society in the college called the Inclusion, Participation and Awareness Society. And the thing about that was that during that time, I got to know other people living on campus, both people with disabilities and without, and we formed a community. And although there were many barriers to my full engagement with the college, including, inaccessible buildings, bad attitudes, but also my chronic illness as well, those barriers didn't seem to matter as much, because I had a community around me and I felt like I belonged. But after that, I went on to represent the student body as the vice president for the Students' Union, and that we should set up a wheelchair basketball team. But I then went on to do a master's in management, and I focused on employment of graduates with disabilities. What I found during that research was that graduates were finding it difficult to gain jobs because they didn't have those extracurricular activities on their CV. And so when they went into interview, they didn't have those extra items to talk about. Um, and those students or those graduates reported back to me that those were the barriers, and the employers were always also noticing that these were missing from their CV. So after that, I worked in the University College Dublin for a couple of years in the area of student transitions and the Office of the Vice President for Students. And I realized, that I really wanted to investigate this, that I really wanted to identify what were the barriers and the enablers to the social engagement of disabled students in higher education. And so I decided to do my PhD in Trinity College Dublin, and that's where my journey has brought me to here at this point.
And did you find it hard as a student or as a person with disability yourself to separate yourself? Because I know this was not an ethnography per se, this research. Was it hard for you to set yourself aside and have sort of an unbiased look at your research? Or what were the types of things that you did to make sure that your research wasn't biased?
That's a really, really important question. And in actual fact, Shelley, that is why I tell the story of my own background first. Because I think it's the first thing you must do is you must look at yourself and look at your positionality and to engage with that and to reflect upon your past and to reflect on where you are now as well. So as you can see there straight away, reflection was a really important part. Engaging in identifying your positionality, really important part. And I engaged in that process throughout my PhD to ensure that there wasn't that bias, and that we have to accept that it is very, very difficult in a qualitative study to take the researcher out of the research. So I think the most important step straight away is to call it out, to acknowledge it, to really question yourself and question your position. And you know what? That can actually be really difficult and quite challenging. And I was very lucky that I had a great supervisor who was prepared to talk to me about it. But also, then I had other disabled researchers in the college that I could rely on and trust to talk about those issues, to tease them out. And I think one of the ones that initially created a challenge for me was the idea, or was I a person with a disability or was I a disabled person?
Mhm.
And that in itself, uh, it actually, I would say I transformed or I evolved over the PhD journey from calling myself a person with a disability, so, person first, to actually describing myself as a disabled person. Because by the end, or I'd say at some point in the research, I saw myself working for transformational change
Mhm.
with my research participants. And of course, one of the key aspects of my research is that I used a combination of the transformative paradigm and the bioecological model. And the key with those is, number one, is that firstly, it puts the student at the center of the research. And but what you're actually doing is you're working with your participants for transformational change by using a social justice approach.
Mhm.
And that furtherance of human rights is what it was really, really, really important to me during my research journey.
And that's actually an amazing response. As you know, you and I, with our, even though our research was very, very different, we always talked about sort of the twinning or the identifying factors that we both had, that we were doing the same. And I also, my research had to be highly reflective as well. And I had to bring my positionality into my research because it was about volunteering and things that I had been so involved in, and what I had to consistently do to take myself out of my research to look back into the participants in my research, because I was so involved and so passionate about volunteering and that kind of thing. So I know that's one of the things that we said, that we'd have those crossovers together with our research. But the other thing that I thought was really important that you said was that idea of making transformational change. So what you're doing in your research was listening to the voice of your participants and listening to the voices of these students, and then working towards transformational change by doing it. So that whole act of, what is student voice, and then actually making those changes at the same time is a really important piece of that. How would you explain to the listeners, to somebody who maybe isn't in the academic or in the university community, how would you explain what student voice is and why it's so important?
Shelley, as you know, I like to keep things simple. And I would like to think that, student voice is an expression of the student, and those expressing their opinions and their views. And of course, it is, I think it's very important that with that voice, there will be differences in views and differences opinions. And of course, critical to all of that is that that voice is heard. And that I really feel that that was one important aspect of my research, was that ensuring that the student was at the center of the research and had the opportunity to have their voice heard. And of course, another important aspect was, I'm a disabled person. Your listeners probably don't know that I have a physical disability myself. I've been a disability rights activist for many, many, many years. And so I could empathize with a lot of the barriers, but also a lot of the barriers to having your voice heard. And a key thing that your listeners may not realize is that disabled people have actually been researched more than being researchers. So it was very significant that a disabled person would be the researcher in this. And that in itself is actually what makes this research somewhat unique, in terms of that there hasn't been research done in Ireland on the social engagement experiences of disabled students, because, to be honest, disabled students in higher education is a relatively new phenomenon. And that's number one. Number two is that there has been a real focus on just getting disabled students into higher education, and focusing on their academic needs, and then let's just get them out, rather than focusing on that wider holistic student experience, that opportunity to socially engage with the wider community, to meet friends, have a coffee, play football, be on the team, be the leader of the team, be the leader of the students' union, or simply to just have your voice heard in class. And I think it's really important that we remember that there are I would feel that there are all different levels of having your voice heard, or different ways of having your voice heard, but none of them are any more or less important. So if like, I mean, I would often hear of disabled people talking about that if we'll take a disabled person who maybe was out for a cup of tea, and they had a personal assistant with them, and that somebody would ask the personal assistant, how many sugars does the disabled person want, as opposed to asking the disabled person. And so that is, not having your voice heard there is just as disempowering as having your voice not heard on not being elected for a big office.
Yeah, and taking that agency away from them.
Absolutely right. Totally right. Totally right.
Yeah. So I actually would love to hear, and I think the listeners would be very interested in hearing about some of the experiences of the students in your research, and maybe some of their struggles to be heard, and the kinds of impacts that it has on them.
Yeah, well, some of the main findings around my research around it, around social engagement, uh, came around a number of themes. So, for instance, the four themes were around engagement. There was college climate, transitions, and structures. And within them, then, within those themes, then there was a range of information around, say, for instance, student belonging. And there was a real connection there between social engagement, having your voice heard, and belonging. And in actual fact, that uh, the majority of the participants, both students and staff, because there was staff also involved in my study. In actual fact, the senior managers in the college were involved in the study, which again was unique to my research, and also the disability support personnel. So those would have been the people who would have supported the students in the front line. And why I took that approach was, which was really a systematic approach, was in terms of I looked at the whole system and the different layers out from the students, following Bronfenbrenner's bioecological model. And so within that, then it was seen that disabled students, although they felt they were socially engaged, almost all of them reported barriers to their social engagement. And those barriers included lack of awareness. Structural barriers still continue to be a problem. Um, and I think one, short story, which I think encapsulates so much that was it. It was a student called Mary, and she had just transitioned to her college and was attending probably her fourth lecture, I think it was. But it was a late evening lecture, and she was sitting at the back of the class in a kind of a little cubicle that exists in some lectures where disabled wheelchair users are actually kind of cordoned off in an area on their own. And she said she was up there on her own and the class went on, and that was fine. But at the end of the class, a number of students came up and introduced themselves and said hello, and they all decided they would go for a coffee. But it turned out that there was no coffee bars open in that building, and so they had to traipse across the entire campus to get to the student building. And when they finally reached it, which took some time and was quite exhausting for the student, they went in and they realized that the coffee dock was upstairs. The elevator didn't work. So the students was like, look, it's fine, we won't bother. And she was like, no, no, look, go for coffee, it's fine, don't worry about it. And so eventually, after much persuasion, they did go for coffee. And she said that that really was the point where she just felt, she didn't belong.
Mm-hmm.
And that what made that worse, though, was she reported that incident to student services. And 4 weeks later, that elevator still wasn't fixed. So there was a combination of factors there that came together to really, uh, firstly, make that student feel like that it didn't belong, but then disempowered that student as well by not listening to that student's voice.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's an example. But in terms of belonging, the majority of students felt that they did belong, yet, that they belonged in their college, yet disabled students were uncertain about their sense of belonging in class.
Mm.
Now, that is the very place that senior managers and disability support personnel want students to be confident about their sense of belonging.
Mm-hmm.
And yet students were uncertain about that. So we have to ask ourselves the question, well, what was happening there?
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that perhaps we could point to is that when students were talking about disability awareness in their college and talking about their college climate, which, by the way, they felt was a very supportive environment and that people cared, but when it came to disability awareness, almost half of disabled students felt their college wasn't disability aware, and that their peers were less aware than the staff.
Interesting.
So yeah, it's very interesting, and I think that's something, that probably needs to be teased out a little bit more. But in terms of voice, students, senior managers and disability support personnel really felt that hearing the voice of students was central to creating a sense of belonging. And of
Yeah.
course, we know that students who feel like they belong are more likely to stay in college. They feel greater levels of happiness and contentment. They actually have greater success in their college. So belonging is very important, and voice is important to that. Yet, senior managers reported that they were unaware of any disabled students in senior leadership positions in their college. So if the students weren't in senior leadership positions, they most likely weren't on decision-making boards within the college. Now, in Ireland, we have a very important program called the Widening Participation Agenda, which is the aim is to increase the diversity of the campus. And there has been quite a degree of success in terms of disabled students, in terms of that the number of disabled students when I attended college in about 2000 and started college in 2002 was just less than 1%. It is now, kind of in around a range of 6.57%. So there has been an increase, but yet senior managers were unaware of any disabled students in senior leadership positions. So how can disabled students have input to the wider decision-making process of the college if they are not on those decision-making boards? And we have to ask the question, well, why? Now, senior managers said, well, actually, you know what? That's the responsibility of the Students' Union. The Students' Union felt, well, yes, we do. It's our representatives, and yes, we probably could be doing more, but we're not really sure about what we need to be doing. Now, the reality is that it is the responsibility of everybody, and it is the college's responsibility in relation to their committees to ensure that. And what was evident from my research was that there really hadn't been any thought or consideration into what needed to be done to facilitate that, and what structures needed to be put in place, or what supports. In actual fact, there was no evidence of any structures or supports. And if we consider that then in terms of the wider agenda within Ireland around student engagement, student success, which students actually spoke about a lot. Students spoke about that a lot. And if we talk about it in terms of our national student engagement program, which sets leadership and diversity and representation as key pillars, we have to ask ourselves, well, what's going on here?
Yeah. And that actually leads me right perfectly into the next question, is that idea of the lip service. So often promotion of student voice, especially student voice for students with disabilities or disabled students, there, that promotion can come off as very tokenistic and lacking any real substance. And do you see changes happening since you started your research, and if so, what are those?
Yes, as you know, Shelley, I'm a pretty optimistic person. So any little change at all, and I will be, think that's very positive. But yes, there are changes taking place. I think probably one of the biggest problems, though, is that those changes are not right across the board. So they're sporadic. They're usually as a result, maybe, of one very interested individual who has made changes in their college and seen that through. However, there are programs, of course, that which have been implemented across the majority of colleges. And I'm thinking, say, peer mentoring and student ambassador programs. And so they were originally implemented for the student body to support the transition of the students into college in the general student body. But what was evident from my research was that these have now actually been established specifically as well for disabled students. Now, of course, they were always open to disabled students to participate, but colleges have now focused on uh, bringing on board disabled students who act as peer mentors maybe for other disabled students or maybe not, which depending on what's their choice. But those programs have been very, very positive. And in my research, I can see lots of evidence of students enjoying those. Now, there was a bit of variability in that, some students really weren't getting a lot out of it. That is the mentors, because I think it's really important that the mentors get as much out of it as the mentees. And that because we do have to remember that the mentor is a student too. It's just they might be 1 year ahead of the students they're mentoring. So I think those programs have been very effective. And I'll give you a very short story. I remember I did an interview with a student, a wheelchair user, who, and I met her off her campus. I met her in an environment that suited her, and that the student was very quiet, very timid. Um, we had a great chat, but it took a while, and I came away thinking this is a shy student. The student didn't seem to be having that much social engagement. But as part of my research, I actually did some site visits to particular colleges, and that I remember going out to the college that student was from, and I met this student as a mentor, and I couldn't believe the difference. This was like 6 months later. And this student had decided after the interview to enroll in the mentoring program and in that college or what they were doing, and and the student was involved in assisting other students transition into college. And the student was so confident, and she was showing leadership skills and was enjoying herself and had friends and fun. And it was just it was a really great example of a program that was working. And it was really, from my perspective, it was super. So I think yes, that there are changes have been taking place, and I think they are working. And that another, I think, important thing around voice, which came up in my research, was around disability peer groups. And that in my research, that among disability support personnel and senior managers to an extent, but mostly disability support personnel, there is really polarized views on the importance or effectiveness of disability peer groups, and whether they should be supporting them, and whether they should be actually encouraging the students to participate in the general student groups. And why should we have these particular disability groups? Was that not a bad thing? Was it a good thing? And there was really quite, some people were quite uh, confident in their views that it was a bad thing and we shouldn't have them. And but what was interesting from my perspective was to see that in the colleges where you had disability peer groups, there was greater disability awareness among the senior managers, among the disability support personnel, among the students' union in particular. Because those groups were liaising with them, and senior managers would speak, of the person, whoever was in charge of that group. Like they were friends, they knew them. And so that was quite interesting. Now, I'm not saying that disability peer groups are the panacea to improving disability awareness in a college, but certainly they're a contributor to doing that. And I think why they are important is because they give people an opportunity to share experiences. And that, I think that's really important in an environment where you're in the minority and you don't see anybody else, and you don't get to ask that question of, are you having that problem too? And finding out, yeah, and then I'm not the only one then. So I think that's really important as in relation to that.
And it really makes having those types of groups really creates an awareness, and it produces this, where something would be often just overlooked and unseen. It creates an awareness so that those who are unseen become seen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really important aspect. And that's why I did this research on the social engagement experience of disabled students in higher education. Because when it came, in terms of, if I go back to the results, in terms of belonging, what was critical to that was those really small social engagement opportunities, like having that cup of tea, like meeting somebody in the corridor. And those were actually those were the key points. I always thought, social engagement was something so much bigger. When I started my research, it was like, being involved in, students' union. But actual fact, in most of the interviews, it was just like, as long as I have someone to go for a cup of tea with, to share my problems with, to improve my mental health, those were the important things to people.
Yeah. And social interaction and social relationships need not be any more than just two people. So,
Absolutely.
you're either an individual by yourself, and that's from a sociological perspective, that is, the importance. It doesn't have to be about a group or about, large groups or small groups. It can be just an interaction between two people, and then it becomes a social, awareness and a social relationship. It just takes two people.
That's right, absolutely. And do you know what, Shelley, what was interesting? And just when we're on, talking about voice here, much of the research and the literature would suggest that disabled students in higher education need to learn to advocate for themselves and have a better understanding of their rights in college. The findings in my research actually suggested somewhat differently. And that from my research, it was obvious that students were generally aware of their rights, and there was evidence of them actively speaking up for themselves. But disabled students were not having their voice heard, and that they found that they were having to advocate much more than the general student body, and they just found that tiring. And so that itself is really disempowering for students, again, who weren't able to have that voice heard, and then just got worn out from having to advocate for small issues like the lift isn't working again, or I can't access the wheelchair toilet because it's locked again. So those were the frustrations of disabled students when it comes to having their voice heard and advocating for themselves.
So what can we do to get educators, schools, government, and policymakers to listen?
Okay, so I think one aspect which I would start with is the need to identify disabled students as role models in leadership positions. So the ones that are currently in leadership positions need to be identified as clear role models. Because in my research, it's a case of if you can't see it, you can't be it. And disabled students in my research reported being very proud of knowing a disabled student who was in a leadership position. So with students responding that it gave them that feeling, if they could do it, then so could I.
Yeah.
And this corresponds with the literature as well, which shows the positive success stories can be empowering and may encourage other students to work through the challenging times. So that's the first thing I do. But the second thing that I'd be recommending is that colleges need to really look at disability proofing their structures within the college. So if, for instance, that you have a college board of some type, that you ensure that you are making sure that the students are offered the supports to be able to engage with that board. So, and that means proactively doing it. It doesn't mean waiting until the first meeting. It means actually getting out there and letting them know in advance that, Yes, if you need a sign language interpreter, we can provide that for you. You don't need to worry.
Mhm.
Yes, if you are a student who needs a personal assistant, we can provide that for you. And that needs to be done. And I think what I found through my research is that within colleges, there wasn't a structure to be able to report that I need these supports. Okay, so for if it's outside your core academic, which there was plenty of, the disability services were very well known and good at that. But outside of that, there wasn't a way of accessing that support. So again, like in the Students' Union, and the Students' Union, I think, have a lot of work to do in this regard, is actually they need to put in a reporting structure. So a disabled student attending an event or attending a society club or meeting or wanting to participate in the elections, that they can actually report, I have a disability and I need some supports. Who
Mhm.
do I go to and how can I access them?
Yeah,
And
it
there was
shouldn't be complicated.
it shouldn't be complicated, but it doesn't exist.
Right.
It doesn't exist. And that's the thing. And Shelley, one thing that was really was quite I was taken aback at was the fact that some students reported that, they went to join certain clubs, and as part of that, they were required to declare their disability. But the students didn't feel comfortable declaring their disability to student leaders of these groups because they wondered, well, where does that information go?
Mhm.
And there needs to be a bit of work done around that in terms of reassuring students that that data is going to be handled confidentially. And
Mhm.
you see, I suppose the issue is that with student groups, as we know, that the leaders of them move on very quickly. And the whole structure of people that were there can move on very quickly. And
Mhm.
so your information moves on then to somebody else.
Mhm.
So there is some work to be done around that too, because it is acting as a barrier to engagement by some students.
Mhm.
So that's number two. So now I've talked about the role models, and number two is the implementation of structures for that, for people to be able to engage. I think number three is that it was noted during my research by senior managers and disability support personnel that in a competitive equality, diversity, and inclusion agenda within the colleges, the disability can actually fall down the priority list. Uh, with other issues, so for instance, maybe I know in Ireland at the moment, gender quotas is very, very significant. Athena Swan,
Yes.
LGBTQ, the international student uh, involved. And so the result is that disability issues fall down. And that is compounded by the fact that you actually don't have disabled students sitting on those boards. Or, which is equally a bigger an issue, you don't have disabled staff
Mhm.
because there are so few disabled staff within higher education. So these issues are being compounded by the fact that we don't have people there. So really, colleges probably need to be taking positive steps to actually um, appoint disabled people onto these committees
Mhm.
in order to support that process, to ensure that voice is represented. So I think that probably could be another step. Funding, of course, is an issue that in terms of, and I think Shelley, you know a little bit about this. Students in my research actually found barriers to their wider civic engagement, so like volunteering. And as you know, civic engagement is a high priority and a part of most colleges' strategies now. And
Mhm.
as to be in order to develop all the key graduate attributes that you're expected to, you are expected also to engage in that wider civic engagement and that volunteering aspect. And for some disabled students, that's not an option
Mhm.
because once you finish class, there may not be the supports to engage in that. And as a result, you don't have that skill on your CV.
Mhm.
You don't obtain that graduate attribute. And so there were examples of senior managers themselves, that's registrars and vice presidents, actually advocating themselves on behalf of disabled students to ensure that funding was found somewhere in order to enable that student to participate. And that, that story sounds great, but that's not a structure.
Hmm.
That's
It's
not
one
a way of
person.
doing it.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
one person.
Hmm.
So I think there is a piece of work around that needs to be done to ensure that we actually say yes, social engagement and civic engagement is important for all students. As a result, we are prepared to fund that and fund those supports where necessary. In some cases, supports are not necessary, but there are for a number of students. Now there is a view that there was a view shared that, well, that should be up to the voluntary organizations. But as you know, some voluntary organizations don't have the resources to do that.
Right.
But so there's a wider discussion that needs to be had about that. And we have to ask ourselves in higher education, well, how much do we value that?
Hmm.
And do we value it equally for all students?
Hmm. And if it's a principle on, if it's, one of the defining principles of your strategic plan, if you're a university, and it's one of the defining principles there, then my opinion would be that it would be the responsibility of the university then to make that available, for students to be able to volunteer. And again, that's kind of a story maybe for another day, but it definitely, is an important. It certainly isn't, the volunteer organization's responsibility, and if it is something that the strategic plan states, that the university says these are the types of graduates the graduate attributes that we want to our graduates to have when they leave the university, that they're civically engaged, then they should, make sure that the structures are in place, to take care of that for all students. Because like you said before, it's everybody's business, and and this really matters. So you can't just say only some students, can be civically engaged because they're able-bodied.
Yeah, and I think, Shelley, that I'm sure you would have, I mean, met disabled students who may have or may not have been able to engage during
Hmm.
your own research.
Hmm. Absolutely. Those who, and it's not even always just who may or may not haven't been able to engage, but we also have to think about those whose engagement is diminished, because maybe they try to engage, or they do engage in some capacity, but they don't have the ability to fully engage because the structures aren't there for them.
Absolutely. That's
Yeah.
absolutely right.
Yeah.
And I think what that comes down to then is that we really need, uh, colleges need to really implement, and I think nationally we need to implement that strategy and policy around that. And we cannot be just leaving it up to one very interested individual,
Mhm.
because that is not that's not a platform or a strategy for success into the future.
No.
And so I feel that at a policy level that we need to really actually embed this now into, and we very shortly we will have a new national plan for equity of access. I believe that it's now time to move on to actually widening out that social experience for disabled students, and to look at those aspects like social engagement, civic engagement, leadership, and the wider experience. And I think if we included it in our national plan, I think it would be very useful, and it would really give colleges some support as well. Because one of the things is that I would say is that there really was an interest and willingness to do something by senior
Mhm.
managers and disability support personnel, and particularly by the students' unions, but they often didn't know what to do.
Mhm.
And so I think that we need to give guidance at a national level now as to what needs to be done.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Vivian, we're now at the point in our conversation when I like to ask my guests, my guest speakers, to share some resources, some links or book recommendations that you think would be helpful for anybody that's interested in finding out more about student voice or how they can help.
Yeah, well, um, I was actually just on and I think it's important in relation to the topic, is around universal design for learning and universal design. And I was actually reading up recently on Katie Novak and Kathleen Turner, and that I think they in terms of universal design, I'd highly recommend that they look at some of that work, especially now in terms of, and I'm thinking of blended learning. And I think it's important during this time of transition into the blended learning environment, especially an environment where that we're going to have maybe some students in class and some students online at the same time, concurrently. And so I think that how do we need to start asking ourselves the question, how do we ensure equity of voice in that environment?
Mhm.
And so in terms of that, I think that might be useful reading for people around universal design for learning. I think as well, head.ie have some great resources that which would be useful. I'm read a lot on follow Twitter, of course, and I think
Mhm.
you can really get some great updates on that. And of course, then I think it's useful to listen to your podcast, Shelley.
Thank you. And I will make sure that the links to like ahead are put into the descriptor for your particular episode here, as well as, if you want, I can put your Twitter handle in, and if there, we have any discussion about some other Twitter handles or hashtags that they could follow or things like that, I can make sure to put them into the descriptor as well. So Vivian, any final words of wisdom before we say adieu?
I think one of the most important things that people can remember or think about is the motto of the independent living movement, which is nothing about us without us. So when you're
Yep.
planning your next committee, just have a little look around the room and ask yourself who's not in the room. And then think of that, nothing about us without us, and start including disabled people.
That is actually wonderful parting advice and wonderful words of wisdom for us. So thank you so much for taking the time. Again, I know that you're quite busy with everything that you have going on, and especially in the process of really disseminating widely this very important research. And so thank you for taking the time to spend with me and with our listeners to talk about this important topic, Vivian. Thank you.
Thank you, Shelley.
I hope that you've enjoyed this discussion on A Dash of Salt, a space where you'll always find fresh and current discussions on society and learning today, seasoned with just the right touch of experts in education and a dash of sociological imagination. Please be sure to like and share this episode, and don't forget to subscribe to A Dash of Salt on Podbean so that you don't miss the next episode. Thanks so much, and we'll chat again soon.